A single Japanese warship slices through the Taiwan Strait on April 17th. To the untrained observer, it might seem like a routine blip on the radar of global maritime traffic, but in the unforgiving realm of great power competition, there are no coincidences, only meticulously crafted signals. This is a calculated insult. April 17th is the exact anniversary of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed 100th. That treaty marked the bitter end of the First Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that culminated in the devastating defeat of the Qing dynasty and the total annihilation of the Beiyang fleet, a naval force built at an exorbitant cost, yet completely hollowed out by systemic corruption and strategic stagnation. By choosing this precise, historically charged day to sail a guided missile destroyer through the strait, Tokyo is not simply conducting a freedom of navigation patrol. It is executing a deliberate, highly orchestrated piece of geopolitical theater designed to summon the ghosts of 1895. I am Marcus. Today, we deconstruct Tokyo's fatal maritime gambit, the drone crosshairs already locked on their fleet, and the unprecedented blueprint being drafted for the complete dismantling of Japan's post-war military architecture. To fully grasp the gravity of this maneuver, we need to peer into the psychological machinery driving Japanese strategic thinking. For well over a century, Tokyo's ascendance on the global stage has been deeply rooted in the doctrine of the asymmetrical gamble. It is the strategy of striking a vastly larger, yet perceived to be vulnerable opponent to seize extraordinary geopolitical dividends. This small versus big mentality paid off spectacularly against the Qing Empire, yielding massive financial reparations that effectively bankrolled Japan's explosive industrialization and military expansion. They rolled those same iron dice in 1904 against the Russian Empire, securing absolute dominance over the Korean Peninsula. And again in 1941, attempting to paralyze the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in a single, audacious stroke. Today, it appears certain hardline factions within Tokyo's defense establishment are viewing the current Pacific standoff through that exact same outdated lens. They are quietly betting that China, despite its colossal economic mass, might harbor the same structural fragility as the decaying empire of the late 19th century. But this is precisely where the historical parallel violently collapses, and where the miscalculation becomes incredibly dangerous. The modern People's Liberation Army Navy is not the tragically flawed Beiyang fleet. We are no longer discussing a fragmented state-fielding purchased, unmaintainable vessels. Instead, we are looking at the largest naval force on the planet by hull count, supported by an unforgiving industrial base that currently accounts for roughly 30% of global manufacturing output. While the Beiyang fleet was paralyzed by an utter lack of indigenous industrial backing, today, Chinese shipyards boast a commercial shipbuilding capacity that outpaces Western competitors by a staggering margin, launching advanced stealth, guided missile cruisers, and deploying electromagnetic catapult aircraft carriers at a tempo that has permanently rewritten the Pacific power equation. By attempting to resurrect the psychological dominance of 1895, Tokyo is leaning on a fading phantom of history. They are walking into the classic trap of empire, mistaking a memory of weakness for the lethal, heavily armored reality of the present. Furthermore, one must ask, how does a nation roughly the size of California physically and psychologically prepare to challenge a continent-sized superpower? The answer lies in the meticulous construction of an elaborate diplomatic and military human shield. In the crucial hours immediately surrounding this maritime provocation, Tokyo did not isolate itself. Instead, it launched a hyper-aggressive diplomatic offensive. Officials systematically summoned 30 ambassadors from NATO member states directly to their capital. Behind closed doors, they carefully engineered the narrative, painting themselves as the solitary vanguard of regional stability and freedom of navigation. while preemptively framing China as an unhinged regional aggressor. This is a masterful, if deeply cynical, exercise in exporting strategic risk by actively entangling the defense frameworks of the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization into the highly volatile Indo-Pacific theater. Japan is effectively daring its competitors to strike, operating under the assumption that any kinetic response would immediately trip the alarm wires of a massive global alliance. This behavior is not a sudden tactical innovation. It is a deeply ingrained historical reflex. If we look back to the dawn of the 20th century, we see that Japan specifically secured the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 before daring to make its decisive, violent move against the Russian Empire. They have continually required the explicit backing, or at least the implicit permission, of a dominant Western maritime power to underwrite and legitimize their imperial expansions. A century ago, it was the British Empire. Today, it is the United States. However, Tokyo is not merely begging for a security umbrella. They are aggressively proving their absolute worth as a foundational pillar of this newly forming Pacific blockade. Exactly one day after the Strait provocation, on April 18th, Japan inked a monumental defense agreement with Australia. They committed to engineering and delivering 11 cutting-edge, high-tonnage missile frigates to the Australian Navy. The first 3 of these heavily armed vessels will be constructed directly on Japanese soil by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. This is a corporate giant with profound historical ties to Japan's wartime aviation and naval buildup, and remarkably, an entity that is currently operating under strict Chinese sanctions. The remaining 8 warships will be built in Australia, facilitating a massive, unprecedented transfer of lethal technology. This is a ruthless flex of industrial muscle. While the United States struggles with severe naval shipyard bottlenecks, chronic labor shortages, and agonizingly slow fleet replenishment rates, Japan is eagerly stepping into the void. They are broadcasting to the entire hemisphere that their defense industrial base is highly capable of arming the Pacific. They are rapidly morphing from a passive protectorate into the primary armory for a containment coalition. Yet, one must critically ask, are these European and Oceanian capitals fully aware of the incredibly high-stakes survival game they are being written into by eagerly accepting Tokyo's strategic narrative and its advanced warships? These geographically distant nations are inadvertently underwriting a localized militaristic resurgence, blindly anchoring their own geopolitical destinies to a volatile fault line they barely comprehend. While Tokyo actively exports its strategic risk to distant European capitals, a highly calculated, deeply cynical political theater is simultaneously unfolding within its domestic borders. The architects of this resurgence are deploying a classic two-faced strategy, perfectly exemplified by the recent maneuvering of prominent hardline political figures. A key conservative leader, known for her staunch militarist leanings, publicly announced she would refrain from her customary personal visit to the Yasukuni Shrine, a deeply controversial site that enshrines 14 convicted class war criminals, alongside millions of other war dead, serving as the spiritual epicenter of unrepentant imperial nostalgia. Her stated rationale was to avoid overstimulating diplomatic relations with China and South Korea, opting instead to send a proxy ritual offering. Told the uninitiated, this might masquerade as a genuine diplomatic concession. Yet, in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of realpolitik, it is nothing more than a psychological trap, a sophisticated testing of the waters. The logic is remarkably self-serving. If Beijing were to soften its diplomatic stance in response to her physical absence, the hardline factions would successfully secure operational breathing room. Conversely, if Beijing correctly identifies the maneuver as superficial and maintains its stern, uncompromising posture, these same politicians can immediately pivot to their domestic base. They can weaponize that refusal, arguing that diplomatic restraint yields absolutely no dividends, thereby retroactively justifying a permanent return to unapologetic militarist posturing. This is the dual-pronged blade of modern political hedging. With one hand, Tokyo offers a hollow, highly publicized diplomatic pause at a controversial shrine. With the other hand, it explicitly authorizes its maritime self-defense force to slice through one of the most heavily fortified and intensely monitored maritime corridors on the planet. This April 17th provocation does not exist in a vacuum. It marks the fourth such transit by Japanese vessels in recent history, following an initial incursion in late 2024 and 2 additional crossings over the subsequent calendar year. This precise brand of political schizophrenia, where diplomatic channels offer superficial concessions, while the military apparatus simultaneously pushes aggressive kinetic boundaries, is hauntingly familiar to any student of history. In the critical, deteriorating months preceding the outbreak of the Pacific War, Imperial Japan repeatedly utilized diplomatic envoys to project a deliberate facade of negotiation and restraint, all while the Naval Command meticulously finalized the blueprints for a preemptive strike. Today's diplomatic hedging serves the exact same purpose. It is the political equivalent of a smoke grenade, deployed specifically to confuse the adversary's threat perception until the tactical trap is fully sprung. The Yasukuni concession is not an olive branch. It is merely a political pendulum pulling backward to gather kinetic momentum for a far more devastating forward strike. In the high-stakes arena of shifting global orders, a compromised apology is often just the opening sequence of a new aggression. However, while Tokyo's political establishment was busy weaving this intricate web of diplomatic smoke and mirrors, Beijing responded with a terrifying absolute clarity. The era of issuing sternly worded diplomatic protests and passive condemnations has entirely evaporated. In the immediate aftermath of the Japanese destroyer's transit through the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese military released high-definition combat drone footage. The video explicitly showed the Japanese vessel locked dead within the crosshairs of the drone's targeting matrix. Can you fully grasp the psychological weight of this maneuver? This is not merely a public relations exercise in the unforgiving grammar of modern electronic warfare. This is a simulated kill, by demonstrating that a drone had effortlessly penetrated the warship's air defense bubble, maintaining a steady optical and radar lock on its missile silos and propulsion systems. The People's Liberation Army was broadcasting a chilling, undeniable truth. Your vessel was already tactically neutralized before it even completed its transit. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a ghost sniper slipping into a heavily guarded compound, not to pull the trigger, but to quietly leave a single polished bullet casing on the target's pillow. Yet, the drone lock was merely the psychological prelude to a massive display of physical force. The true kinetic counter-strike materialized the very next day, on April 18th. The Chinese Navy deployed the guided missile destroyer Bao-2, a Type 052D apex predator of the seas, directly into Japan's strategic backyard. Let us break down the sheer hardware involved here. The Bao-2 is not a coastal patrol boat. It is a 7,500-ton behemoth of advanced metallurgy and radar evasion architecture. It is armed with 64 vertical launch cells, boasting an immense magazine depth, capable of simultaneously orchestrating anti-air, anti-ship, anti-submarine, and long-range land attack operations. This floating fortress deliberately carved its path through the Takara Strait, designated as waterway number 133, a highly sensitive and narrow maritime corridor situated between Amami Island and Tokara Island in the Ryukyu chain. The geography here is paramount to understanding the severity of the countermaneuver. This choke point is at its widest, barely 80 kilometers across. If a vessel navigates precisely down the middle, it remains a mere 40 kilometers from the coastline. In international maritime law, a nation's sovereign territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles, while its contiguous zone reaches out to 24 nautical miles. By pushing a 7,500-ton destroyer with multi-dimensional strike capabilities right against the invisible boundaries of this contiguous zone, Beijing actively demonstrated a suffocating, undeniable projection of hard power. This maneuver forcefully shatters the illusion that Japan's peripheral waters and strategic island chains offer any form of impenetrable sanctuary. The joint naval and aerial combat patrols, currently forming an iron ring around the Japanese archipelago, are meticulously designed to box in any expansionist ambitions before they can materialize. When confronting a state deeply intoxicated by the memory of its own historical gambles, diplomatic silence is inevitably misinterpreted as structural weakness. The only vocabulary capable of breaking that dangerous delusion is the uncompromising, cold steel architecture of overwhelming firepower. When the drumbeat of militarism grows this deafening, global strategists are no longer afforded the luxury of mere observation. They are forced to engage in the grim but entirely necessary exercise of macro geopolitical projection. If Tokyo insists on pushing this high-stakes maritime friction past the point of no return, the international community must actively draft the uncompromising blueprint for a post-war administrative architecture. Let us ground this hypothetical scenario in brutal statistical reality. Japan is currently operating with a median demographic age approaching 50 years old, a rapidly contracting industrial workforce, and a staggering sovereign debt burden that massively exceeds 250% of its gross domestic product. A society confronting severe demographic decline simply cannot replace a lost generation of sailors and combat pilots. Furthermore, the immediate financial shockwave of paralyzed maritime trade routes would instantly vaporize the capital reserves holding its fragile economy together. The sheer mathematical impossibility of sustaining a protracted, high-intensity industrial conflict under these conditions dictates that any kinetic escalation would be devastatingly swift. Consequently, the subsequent geopolitical restructuring must be absolute, ensuring that the architecture of aggression is never rebuilt. The first non-negotiable pillar of this theoretical post-war framework involves the total, systemic dismantling of the nation's dual-use defense industrial base. The massive corporate conglomerates, currently securing lucrative international contracts to manufacture advanced missile frigates, aerospace components, and electromagnetic sensors, must face comprehensive structural liquidation. The latent capacity to seamlessly pivot from commercial heavy machinery to lethal military hardware must be systematically zeroed out, permanently disabling the physical machinery of regional provocation. The second, and perhaps most geopolitically seismic, pillar centers on the structural emancipation of the Ryukyu Island chain, a territory commonly referred to today as Okinawa. Before its forced, systematic annexation in the late 19th century, the Ryukyu Kingdom maintained an independent, thriving international status, serving as a vital, peaceful maritime hub, with deep tributary and trade ties across the Asian continent. Actively cultivating the restoration of Ryukyuan geopolitical identity and international sovereignty is not merely an academic exercise in historical justice. It is a critical strategic imperative. Emancipating this territory would permanently shatter the first island chain. the very barrier utilized by external powers to project strategic claustrophobia onto the Asian mainland. By removing this crucial archipelago from Tokyo's military jurisdiction, the entire architecture of Pacific encirclement collapses overnight. Finally, this comprehensive blueprint demands the absolute eradication of all foreign military basing rights across the home islands, shrinking the operational footprint of external maritime competitors to zero. In the profound allegory of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's classic tale, the devastating baobab trees begin their existence as tiny, innocuous sprouts, entirely indistinguishable from harmless rosebushes. Yet, if the vigilant gardener does not ruthlessly uproot them the precise moment they are identified, their sprawling, parasitic roots will inevitably pierce the crust and shatter the entire planet to pieces. The baobab tree of militarism is sprouting once again in the Pacific. If left unchecked, its roots will shatter the bedrock of regional stability. But this time, the gardener is awake and the shears are drawn. We are witnessing the final days of historical amnesia. How long can Tokyo dance on the edge of the blade before it slips? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you value relentless, unvarnished geopolitical truth, subscribe and join the ranks of independent thinkers. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.